The moment 82-year-old Paul Simon walked onto the Voice stage, something extraordinary filled the air. Not because of his appearance, though his frail frame and careful steps were evident under the bright studio lights, but because of the weight of musical history that followed him. The knowledge that one of the greatest songwriters in American music history was about to grace the stage where so many young artists had launched their dreams. What nobody in that studio was prepared for was witnessing the heartbreaking reality of aging's effect on a brilliant mind. The cruel way that time can steal not just physical abilities, but the very memories that define who we are, especially when those memories contain the songs that have become part of the world's collective consciousness. Hidden in this moment was not just the story of one man's struggle with the inevitable effects of aging, but a meditation on memory, on the way great art transcends even the limitations of the minds that created it, on the profound connection between artists and audiences that allows songs to live on even when their creators can no longer fully remember them. Let me take you back to understand how this moment came to be. Because Paul's appearance on The Voice represents not just a tribute to one of music's greatest talents, but a reminder of how the songs we create can outlive our ability to remember creating them. Paul Simon had been one of the most influential songwriters of the 20th century, crafting melodies and lyrics that had become part of the American songbook. From his early days with Art Garfunkel as Simon and Garfunkel to his successful solo career, Paul had created songs that transcended generational boundaries, speaking to universal human experiences with a poetry and musical sophistication that had influenced countless other artists. Songs like The Sound of Silence, Bridge Over Troubled Water, Mrs. Robinson, and Graceland hadn't just been hits, they had become cultural touchstones, pieces of music that people turned to during moments of reflection, celebration, and contemplation. Paul's ability to capture complex emotions in seemingly simple lyrics, combined with his innovative approach to melody and arrangement, had made him one of the most respected figures in popular music. But at 82, Paul had been quietly battling the early stages of dementia, a diagnosis that his family had kept largely private out of respect for his dignity and his legacy. The condition had been progressing slowly but steadily, affecting not just his short-term memory, but his ability to recall some of the songs that had defined his career and shaped his identity as an artist. The invitation to appear on The Voice had come through Blake Shelton, personally, who had long been an admirer of Paul's songwriting abilities and had covered several Simon and Garfunkel songs during his own career. Blake understood that Paul's appearance would be more than just a tribute, it would be an opportunity for younger viewers to witness the work of a true master, to understand the craftsmanship that went into creating songs that had lasted for decades. Paul's family had been hesitant about the appearance, knowing that his memory issues had been becoming more pronounced, especially when he was in unfamiliar environments or under stress. But Paul himself had insisted on accepting the invitation, saying that he wanted to share his music one more time, to remind people of the songs that had meant so much to him throughout his career. "Music is the one thing that still makes sense to me," Paul had told his family during the discussions about the appearance. "Even when I can't remember what I had for breakfast, I can still feel the songs in my heart. I want to share that feeling one more time." Standing on The Voice stage now, Paul felt both the excitement and the anxiety that had become constant companions as his memory had become less reliable. The bright lights seemed overwhelming, the audience larger than he had expected, the environment more chaotic than the intimate settings where he had been performing in recent years. Blake Shelton, Kelly Clarkson, John Legend, and Niall Horan sat in their red chairs, all turned to face him with expressions of profound respect and anticipation. Each of them understood that they were in the presence of musical royalty, someone whose songs had influenced their own musical development and whose legacy would outlast all of their careers combined. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake announced with barely contained excitement, "we have the incredible honor of welcoming one of the greatest songwriters in the history of American music. His songs have been the soundtrack to countless lives, and tonight we get to hear one of those masterpieces performed by the man who created it. Please welcome the legendary Paul Simon." The studio erupted in applause that went on for several minutes, with audience members rising to their feet in recognition of Paul's contributions to music. The ovation seemed to energize Paul initially, reminding him of why he had fallen in love with performing in the first place, of the connection that existed between artist and audience when music was at its best. Paul stepped up to the microphone, holding his acoustic guitar with hands that trembled slightly, but still showed the muscle memory of decades of playing. He had chosen to perform The Sound of Silence, the song that had launched his career with Art Garfunkel and had become one of the most recognizable songs in popular music history. "This is a song I wrote a long time ago," Paul began, his voice quieter than it had been in his prime but still carrying the intelligence and sensitivity that had always characterized his performances. It was about feeling disconnected in a world that seemed to be moving too fast, about the difficulty of real communication in a society that was becoming increasingly superficial. Paul began to play the opening chords, his fingers finding their way across the guitar strings through decades of muscle memory. When he started singing, his voice carried the weight of someone who had lived long enough to see how prophetic his early songs had been, how relevant they remained in a world that had indeed become more disconnected and superficial than he had imagined when he wrote them. "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again." For the first verse, Paul's performance was strong and clear, his voice showing some of the wear of age, but maintaining the emotional depth that had always been his greatest strength as a performer. The audience listened in reverent silence, understanding that they were witnessing something rare and precious, a master performing his own masterpiece. But as Paul moved into the second verse, something began to go wrong. He paused longer than usual between lines, his brow furrowing with concentration, as he struggled to remember words that he had sung thousands of times over the decades. "Because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping." Paul's voice faltered as he reached for the next line, the words that should have come automatically suddenly seeming elusive and distant. He stopped playing entirely, looking confused and frustrated as he tried to recall lyrics that had become second nature to him over 50 years of performing the song. "I'm sorry," Paul said quietly into the microphone, his voice betraying the panic he was feeling. I can't remember my own words. This is my song. I wrote this song, but I can't remember how it goes." The studio fell into stunned silence as everyone processed what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a case of stage fright or nervousness. This was a brilliant mind struggling with the cruel reality of memory loss, a creator unable to access his own creation. Paul looked around the stage with growing confusion, as if he wasn't entirely sure where he was or how he had gotten there. The familiar environment of a television studio, which should have been second nature to someone who had performed on every major stage and television show over his decades-long career, suddenly seemed foreign and overwhelming. Where am I?" Paul asked, his voice smaller now, tinged with the fear that comes from losing your bearings in a world that no longer makes complete sense. "I was supposed to sing something, but I can't remember what it was. There are so many people here, and I can't remember why they're all looking at me." Blake Shelton felt his heart break as he watched one of his musical heroes struggling with confusion and fear on stage. Without thinking, without consulting anyone, without following any protocol, Blake was out of his chair and moving toward the stage. His cowboy boots clicked against the polished floor as he approached this musical legend who needed help, who needed someone to remind him where he was and why he was there. "Mr. Simon," Blake said softly, as he reached Paul, his voice gentle but confident. "You're on The Voice. You came here to sing The Sound of Silence for us. It's okay, sir. You're safe, and we're all here because we love your music." Paul looked at Blake with eyes that seemed to be struggling to focus, to make sense of what was happening around him. "The Sound of Silence?" Paul repeated, as if hearing the title for the first time. "Did I write that? It sounds familiar, but I can't quite place it." Blake's eyes filled with tears as he realized the full extent of what Paul was experiencing, the cruel irony of a songwriter forgetting his own songs, of a poet losing access to his own poetry. But Blake also understood something profound, that even if Paul couldn't remember his songs, the songs themselves had taken on a life of their own, living in the hearts and minds of millions of people who had been touched by his music over the decades. "Mr. Simon," Blake said, his voice growing stronger with conviction, "you may not remember writing that song right now, but I promise you that everyone in this studio knows every word. Your songs have become part of all of us. You don't need to remember them because we remember them for you." But this is the moment no one in the studio and no one watching at home ever saw coming. Blake turned to address the entire studio, his voice carrying across the space with the authority of someone who had spent years understanding the power of music to bring people together. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blake announced, "Mr. Paul Simon may not be able to remember the words to his song right now, but I guarantee that every person in this studio knows them by heart. This is what happens when someone creates something truly beautiful. It stops being just theirs and becomes part of everyone who has ever been moved by it." Blake looked directly at Paul, whose confusion was beginning to clear slightly as he sensed the love and support surrounding him. "Mr. Simon, we're going to sing your song with you, not because you need our help, but because your song has become our song too. Because that's what great art does. It becomes bigger than the person who created it." Blake began to sing the opening lines of "The Sound of Silence," his voice strong and clear in the silent studio. "Hello, darkness, my old friend. I've come to talk with you again." Kelly Clarkson immediately joined in, her powerful voice blending with Blake's as they continued the song that had become part of the soundtrack of their own lives. John Legend added his voice to the chorus, and Niall, despite the song being from before his time, sang along with words he had learned through covers and cultural osmosis. But the most moving moment came when the audience began to sing. Not prompted by any producer or cued by any signal, hundreds of people in the studio began to sing Paul Simon's words back to him, creating a chorus of voices that seemed to span generations and musical styles. "Because a vision softly creeping left its seeds while I was sleeping." As the voices filled the studio, something remarkable happened to Paul. The confusion in his eyes began to clear, replaced by a wonder and recognition that seemed to come from deep within his musical memory. Even if he couldn't remember writing the song, he could feel its rightness, its truth, its connection to something essential in the human experience. Paul began to sing along softly, his voice joining the chorus of hundreds of other voices singing his words back to him. It didn't matter that he couldn't remember creating them. In this moment he was experiencing them as if for the first time, feeling the power of music to connect people across time and space and individual limitations. And the words of the prophets are written on the subway walls and tenement halls, and whispered in the sounds of silence. When they reached the final verse, Paul's voice grew stronger, as if being surrounded by the song he had created was awakening something in his memory that went deeper than conscious thought. His hands found their way back to his guitar, and he began to play along with the singing, the chord progressions coming naturally even when the words had seemed elusive. As the song ended, the silence in the studio was profound and respectful. Then, slowly, the applause began, not the excited applause of entertainment, but the reverent applause of gratitude, of recognition, of love for someone who had given so much beauty to the world. Blake remained beside Paul throughout the applause, making sure he understood that he was surrounded by people who appreciated not just his talent, but his courage in appearing despite the challenges he was facing. "Mr. Simon," Blake said when the applause finally died down, "what you just experienced is the true measure of artistic success. You created something so beautiful, so true, so universal, that it has become part of the collective human experience. Even when you can't remember creating it, it lives on in all of us who have been touched by it." Paul looked around the studio with clearer eyes, seeming to understand where he was and why he was there. "Did we just sing together?" he asked Blake, his voice carrying a mixture of confusion and wonder. "We did," Blake replied with a smile. "We all sang your song together, Because it's not just your song anymore, Mr. Simon. It belongs to everyone who has ever felt alone in a crowd, everyone who has struggled to communicate in a noisy world, everyone who has found comfort in the sound of silence. Kelly Clarkson approached the stage, tears streaming down her face. Mr. Simon, your songs have been the soundtrack to so many of our lives. Thank you for sharing your gift with the world. And thank you for reminding us that great art transcends even the limitations of memory. John Legend added, "What happened here tonight shows us that when you create something truly beautiful, it takes on a life of its own. Your songs live in all of us now, and they always will." Niall, clearly moved despite his youth, said simply, "I may not have been alive when you wrote that song, Mr. Simon, but it's been part of my life since I first heard it." That's the power of real artistry. It crosses generations and becomes timeless. The segment became one of the most watched and most shared moments in The Voice history, not because it was polished or perfectly executed, but because it captured something authentic about art, memory, and the way great songs can outlive even the minds that created them. The response from viewers was overwhelming. Thousands of people wrote to share their own experiences with aging family members who had dementia or Alzheimer's, describing how music often remained accessible even when other memories had faded. Music therapists wrote to explain how songs learned in youth often persist in memory long after other information has become inaccessible. Many viewers wrote about how the segment had given them a new appreciation for Paul Simon's catalog, sending them back to rediscover songs they had taken for granted. Younger viewers who might never have heard of Paul Simon before this appearance found themselves exploring his music and understanding why these songs had endured for so many decades. "That night taught me something profound about the nature of artistic legacy," Blake said in interviews afterward. Paul Simon may not have been able to remember his song in that moment, but his song remembered itself through all of us who had been touched by it. That's the true measure of great art. It becomes bigger than the artist who created it. The appearance also sparked conversations about aging, memory, and dignity in the entertainment industry. Rather than being seen as a failure or an embarrassment, Paul's struggle was viewed as a reminder of our shared humanity, of the courage required to continue creating and sharing even when our abilities change. Paul Simon's family released a statement after the show aired, thanking The Voice and its audience for the love and respect shown to Paul during his appearance. They explained that while Paul's memory issues had made the experience challenging for him, the response from the audience and the other performers had reminded him of why he had devoted his life to music in the first place. "Music has always been Paul's first language," the statement read. "Even when words fail him, even when memory becomes unreliable, the songs remain." What happened on The Voice was a beautiful reminder that the music we create becomes part of something larger than ourselves, something that can comfort and sustain us even when we can no longer fully remember creating it. Blake learned something that night that changed his understanding of artistic legacy forever. "Paul showed me that the greatest gift we can give as artists isn't perfection or technical brilliance, it's creating something so true, so universal, so deeply human that it becomes part of other people's lives. When you do that, your art outlives any limitation, any challenge, even the loss of your own memory." Because sometimes the most powerful performances are the ones that remind us what truly matters about art. Sometimes the most moving moments come when vulnerability meets love, when struggle meets support, when individual memory meets collective remembrance. And sometimes an 82-year-old songwriter forgetting his own words can teach us all that great songs don't just belong to the people who write them. They belong to everyone who has ever found meaning, comfort, or connection in their lyrics and melodies. Paul Simon's appearance proved that The Voice isn't just about discovering new talent, it's about honoring the voices that have shaped our musical landscape, about understanding that artistry transcends individual limitations, and about recognizing that when someone creates something truly beautiful, it becomes part of the shared human experience, living on even when the creator can no longer fully remember the act of creation. The sound of silence it turns out, is filled with the voices of everyone who has ever been moved by a song. Everyone who remembers when the songwriter cannot, everyone who carries the music forward when the musician can no longer carry it alone.